Hey, how's it going, guys? I hope that this video finds you well. This video is a review of plant systems. We're going to be talking about everything that you need to know for plants so that you can get some help during the STAR test. You're expected to know a lot about plants, and there's going to be at least 3 questions about plant systems in that STAR test. So this is going to be very helpful information. Make sure that you have the notes paper that goes with this video. Make sure that you're filling in those blanks and that you're going along the video. If you feel that I'm going a little too fast, feel free to stop the video at any point so that you can fill in some blanks. And also, if you want to rewind a little bit, you can do so that you can listen to the information a little more carefully. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the first thing, and that is our objective. The content objective, the TIC, is 10B, and it states that students will be able to describe the interactions that occur among systems that perform the function of transport, reproduction, and response in plants. So the main 3 things that we have to cover here are plant transport, plant reproduction, and plant response. So let's go over the 3 main systems that we're going to be discussing today. So the first one is the root system. So the root system is basically anything that is below the ground. So any roots that the plant has is part of its root system, and the main job of it is to absorb water, and later on that water will be transported up to the leaves. But again, the roots, the only job they do is just to absorb water. The next one is the vascular or the shoot system. And the job of this vascular or shoot system is to get that water and transport it all the way up from the roots to the leaves of the plants. Now, the last one, third one that we're going to be discussing is the reproductive system. And it's very simply, the purpose of it is to produce offspring. So, what is the purpose? Why is it that plants need these systems? Well, let's make sure that we have a little bit of this information first. Photosynthesis is basically uses raw materials to produce food for the plant. So if the plant is not capable of doing photosynthesis, it's likely that the plant will not be able to survive. So it's going to use these systems that I just talked about, especially 2 of them, the root and the vascular system, to move these raw materials from one place to another. So make sure that you have the reactants for photosynthesis, that is carbon dioxide and water, together with light. Sometimes they put it on top of the arrow instead of on the other side. But these are the 3 reactants that plants need. And the water is, plants get it from the roots. The CO2, they actually get it through the leaves, as well as the light, they get it through the leaves. So what are they going to produce? They're going to produce glucose, which is a form of energy that they can store for later use, and they're going to produce oxygen gas. So some of these reactants must enter or be transported to the leaf, like I just mentioned, and the products must also be transported around or exited from the plant. Now, let's talk about the root system. So the main purpose, what is the main purpose of the root system? That is to basically absorb water. So the main job is to absorb water. Make sure that you write that down. The next thing is that plants are actually going to use the process called osmosis to take in this water without using any energy whatsoever. So that whenever there's enough moisture around the plants or around the root hairs, this water will automatically go inside of the root, simply because there is a higher concentration of water outside of the cell than inside of the cell. So because of this process, plants do not need any water whatsoever or they don't need any energy, any energy whatsoever to absorb the water. The last thing is that the more root hair that they have, the more root hairs that they have, well, this is going to increase surface area. And as a result, the more surface area they have, that means that more water absorption. So that is something that is actually good for the plant. So the next thing that we have here is the vascular system. And the job of the vascular system is to basically transport water and nutrients throughout the plant. So it says here that the vascular system consists of tiny tubes inside of the plant. Think of it kind of like the circulatory system in humans. Its job is to transport water and transport nutrients and blood all throughout. Well, plants have a similar system that is going to be called the vascular system. It has two different tubes, two different microtubules, very tiny tubes. One is called the xylem, and the job of the xylem is to move water from the roots to the leaves. The other one is the phloem, and the phloem's job is to move most nutrients or mostly nutrients in both directions. So anywhere that some of the nutrients may go up to the leaves, or some nutrients may be made in the leaves and then come back down to the roots to be used later on. So you got to remember these two words. You got to remember xylem, its only job is to move water, and you got to remember phloems, its job is to move nutrients throughout the plant. So the other system that we have here actually, and I forgot to mention this one at the beginning, is the dermal system. It's kind of like the skin of the plant. And they have what is called a cuticle layer. The cuticle layer is kind of like a very waxy cover that covering that plants have on top of the leaves. And what that does is that they help them prevent any water loss. Um, Plants that live in the desert, you can actually see that they have a thicker cuticle layer, or a thicker dermal system. And that's because they need to store that water inside of them for a long period of time. So their dermal system is a lot thicker than you will see on other plants that don't live in deserts, that live in more tropical areas. So what it consists of also is something called stomata. And stomata and guard cells, what they do is that they regulate how much water goes in and out of the cell. So the way they do this is very simple. It says that when there's a lot of water, what's going to happen is that when there's a lot of water inside of the plant or inside of these cells, the guard cells are going to swell. And when they swell, they actually open a small pore. It kind of looks like this. These two right here on the sides are the guard cells. And whenever they swell, they actually open a little hole in the middle, and that's where water can be evaporated from. So it basically releases water because the plant may have too much water inside of it. Whenever there's very little water inside of the plant, what's going to happen is that these cells are going to collapse. And what they're going to do is they're going to close with each other, and they're not going to let any water evaporate out of the plant. So make sure that you write these things down. So the next system is the reproductive system. And for the reproductive system, you have to understand one thing. Plants can reproduce sexually, and they can also reproduce asexually. So the most important thing that you have to remember here is the different parts of the flower, because flowers are the reproductive organs of the plant. So it all starts with the male parts that we're going to call the stamen. Make sure that you write these things down on your paper, because you got to remember this word. The stamen is the male part of the plant, and it has two parts. It has the anther, which produces pollen, and then it has the filament that is going to hold that anther straight up like this. The next part is the female part of the plant. And yes, flowers have male and female parts sometimes. They can have both sexes. So this is going to be called the carpel. Sometimes it's also called the pistil. So it consists of three parts. It has a stigma, it has a style, and then it has an ovary. And the ovary all the way down here is where you will see the seeds. And these tiny little seeds will later on be fertilized by a pollen grain that is going to go through the stigma. It's going to travel all the way down the style, and it's going to go to the ovary, where it's all going to become seeds, and eventually you will have other plants. So just other parts that are important to mention are the petals, and the job of the petals are obviously to attract pollinators. And then the other one that is important to mention is the sepal, which actually the job of the sepal is to protect part of the flower before it actually opens. So make sure that you have that information. It's very important that you remember the male part, stamen, the anther is the one that produces the pollen, and then remember the carpel or the pistil, which is the one that has the 3 female parts, and that's where the ovary is in place, and that's where seeds come from, basically. So let's talk a little bit about some positive things and some negative things of sexual and asexual reproduction. You don't have to write this information down, by the way. You don't need to write this down. I just want to make sure that we cover some of it. So let's talk about sexual reproduction. It is the whenever we involve sex cells and fertilization. Remember that this involves meiosis. So asexual reproduction does not involve sex cells and does not involve fertilization. So only one parent is required in here. What are some advantages and disadvantages? Well, for sexual reproduction, an advantage is that offspring are not genetically identical. And what this does is that it provides more genetic variation. So that's a positive. The fact that there's more genetic variation can be an advantage for organisms. The only disadvantage is that it takes a lot of time and it's very slow for plants, because you got to get that grain or that pollen into the ovary of the plant, and that sometimes can take a long time for some pollinators like bees to get that pollen from one place to another. So asexual reproduction, it's quite good because it's very fast. So plants can do it really, really quickly. They can reproduce super, super fast. But the problem with it is that offsprings are genetically identical to the parent, and not having variation is not a good thing, because then that means that you cannot get used to a new environment if it happens that you are placed in a new environment. So the last thing that we're going to mention is plant response. So this is the very last thing. This is the response in plants. And what you got to know about plant response is that plants use hormones and electrical signal to respond to their environment. So yeah, plants don't really move, but rather they respond to stimulus inside around their environment. So there's 3 ways that plants do this. The first one is called phototropism, and phototropism is when plants tend to grow towards a light source, kind of like you see in here. You see sometimes how flowers do this very often. They kind of tend to lean towards a light source, and that's because they are actually using hormones inside of them to lean towards that light source. The next one is gravitropism, sometimes also called geotropism. And the job of geotropism is that it actually responds to a plant based on gravity. So plants, if you notice, their roots are always going to grow downwards, and their shoots and stems and all the things are actually going to grow upwards. And plants can do this because they respond to gravitropism. They actually understand, well, not really understand, but they can actually respond to gravity. The last one is called thigmotropism. And thigmotropism basically means that plants' response of plants to touch. So if you've noticed, especially vines, they can do this very often. They can actually grow attached to walls, and they can attach to different cables and things, and they can actually grow upwards. And that's because, they can actually respond to their environment based on specific hormones. And this is the hormone that you guys have to remember. It's called auxin, and that's the hormone that tells the plants in which direction to move or in which direction to grow, according to these 3 things: phototropism, geotropism, and then thigmotropism. All right, so that's everything that I have for you. I hope that you found this information helpful and interesting. And don't forget to complete this assignment, and I'll see you on the next video. See you guys.